When you study anthropology, most of the time your loftiest goal is finding an unknown, long-dead civilization. Getting to make the first contact with a living, breathing, and brand new culture was like finding the Holy Grail in a field of four-leaf clovers. So needless to say, that when my team and I got the opportunity, we were over the moon. Our boat cut through the waters of the coast of Brazil towards the Modesty-sized island. My crew was small, but experienced. Amy, Greg, myself, and our translator Miguel. Why bring a translator to a totally uncontacted tribe? Well, it didn't hurt hoping that the tribe spoke Portuguese somehow. We all knew it was a snowball's chance in hell, but you never know. Our boat slowed as we neared the beach. We landed softly, and our spirits were higher than ever. God, what a rush. The game plan was to lead with Miguel, obviously. The other three of us didn't exactly look local, even on the mainland. So we were hoping that Miguel having at least close to the same skin color would help. There was about 50 feet of beach in front of us, followed by a dense tree line. You couldn't see more than 5 feet into the brush, so naturally, the three of us imagined a tribe 6 feet in. We were excited, but we knew what we were doing was dangerous. Uncontacted tribes tend to be violent to outsiders. We didn't want to look like we were bringing an army. That's why there was only the 4 of us. Saying we'd be outnumbered was an understatement. Even more, we had no idea the state of the island people on any level. Was it one giant tribe? Many small ones? We could have been walking into a war zone for all we knew. Walking into the tree line wasn't much better than suicide, so we waited. It was a beautiful day. The beach was calming. I could wait until someone stumbled upon us. It was about an hour before we heard a yell from behind the trees. We all instantly jumped up. Miguel took point. We all had to be trained to shoot before our outing, and we were all given a pistol and a knife for self-protection. My hand instantly went to my gun, but it stayed holstered. Slowly, from the trees, a small troop of native men approached. Each of them held a drawn bow, pointed towards us. They were dark-skinned, shirtless, and each were covered with dark red tattoos, head to toe. The tattoos were different on each person, but they were just as intricate as they were unique. They were all rather skinny. A few had pot bellies, but otherwise they seemed strong and healthy. They all had very short hair, minus the one leading the brigade, who had long braided hair down to the middle of his back. They inched towards us at a snail's pace. Each of them stepped in unison. They had definitely trained for situations like this. The long-haired one yelled something. I had no idea what it was. Miguel said something back. Couldn't tell what that was either. What's going on? Amy's whisper yelled through her teeth at Miguel. I am asking if they speak Portuguese. Miguel turned and faced Amy to say it. Smart. We didn't want them thinking we were doing anything sneaky. He turned back to them and tried communicating again. There were a few sentences back and forth, with the Portuguese word for Portuguese being brought up by Miguel each time. Their bows were still drawn. Each of us had at least 2 arrows aimed on us. The long-haired leader seemed to be getting agitated with Miguel, but suddenly, one of the men on his right spoke up. I picked up one word that didn't mean anything to me, but he said it many times. Ajugadu. He said at least once in each sentence. The leader took a moment, before lowering his bow, and turned to his small battalion. They all kept their bows up. Ajugadu? He asked them as a group. One agreed immediately, and repeated it back to him. Then another, and another. Slowly but surely, they all lowered their bows. I like this Ajugadu thing, Greg joked to the rest of us. 4 of the soldiers slowly circled us and ended up behind us, leaving the leader still in front of us. He nodded and then said another sentence in whatever language he spoke. He beckoned us with his hand and turned around. He wanted us to follow him. The optimist screamed in my head that we were in, and I only really cared to listen to the optimist at this point. We entered the tree line and followed the long-haired man, and we were followed by his soldiers. It was only a minute or two before Amy asked what a jukudu meant to Miguel. "I don't know," he admitted. "It could mean throw them a feast for all I know." Greg and I looked at each other, smiled, and nodded our heads. Or it could mean, "Let's skin them alive in town square." It's a toss-up, he finished. Greg and I stopped nodding at each other. It was a short walk to their village, no more than 10 minutes. It consisted of about 20 huts, all in a round circle, some closer and some further from the center. A giant fire pit was the centerpiece. There were a few more people out and about, mostly women and children. The women shared the red tattoos, but had much fewer of them, but their faces were pierced all over. Their eyebrows, lips, noses, and ears. It seemed like each woman shared this. The children didn't seem to have their tattoos or piercings yet, and were busy chasing each other between the huts. That is, until they saw us. Every person in town turned to stare at us. A few of the women said something. One of the few men grabbed a child and hung on to her. The soldiers around us didn't seem to care. They continued on to one of the far huts. 2 of the soldiers took guard outside the hut, while the leader stepped inside. Miguel followed him, and I followed Miguel. Inside was a man sitting on a large woven bed. He looked much like the soldiers. Short hair, tattoos. The 2 locals talked for a moment. The topic was clearly the aliens that had landed on their shore. It was a short chat before the leader left us in the hut with the new man. He spoke to Miguel. His language sounded more familiar. A smile crossed Miguel's face as he responded. He turned to us. He speaks Portuguese. Greg, Amy, and I looked at each other like we had just struck gold. It was another minute before we got more information. Miguel filled us in. He has been to the mainland. His name is a jukudu. I have told him we are here for academic purposes and to extend an olive branch. He says he will translate for us, he announced excitedly. I almost fainted. This couldn't have been going better in my wildest dreams. Holy shit, I yelled as I hugged Amy and then Greg. Having to go from the native language to Portuguese to English was a pain we were all willing to easily overlook. We exited the tent and a jukudu took a stance near the center of town. He announced something loudly. He had the attention of the whole tribe. Even more poked their heads out of their own huts. Once he was done, the townspeople seemed to relax a bit, and the long-haired man came over to greet us again. A jukudu told us we were welcomed by the town, and the long-haired man, the chieftain, even offered to call their sister tribe for a celebration in a few days. We graciously accepted, of course. We were treated like family for the next 2 days. We learned how they prepared their food and spices. We learned a local sport, where they use a ball of tree bark and had to carry it between 2 goals, but they had to balance it on the end of a stick the whole time. They couldn't touch it with their bodies. They were ridiculously skilled at it, even though it sounds impossible. Full body contact as well. I was more sore the next morning. We learned that the children getting their tattoos and piercings was a rite of passage into adulthood. This was absolutely incredible. I had a big interest in their sister tribe. Shortly after we initially arrived, we heard what sounded like a horn in the distance. A jukudu explained it was the other tribe. It was such an interesting sound. I had never heard a horn quite like it. I grilled a Jukadu about the sister tribe to the point I think he was getting tired of me. Still though, he answered all my questions. Apparently the other tribe wasn't a fifth of the size of their own, but they still controlled about 80% of the island. He explained that hundreds of years ago, the two tribes warred, and a Jukadu's tribe was defeated. They still respected the borders that their forefathers had agreed on, even though the tribes had been on good terms longer than any of them had been alive. The emissary from the sister tribe coming to the celebration that had been planned was a great honor for their tribe. I was disappointed with that. Apparently only one of them was coming. A Jukadu assured me though, it was a good thing. Any more than one of them showing up would mean a party that would never end. It came to our third day on the island, and the first thing I heard was Greg asking about the celebration. The chieftain explained to him, through our two translators, that it would be that night, and would be in honor of the white men. Hey, that's what I like to hear. I smiled as I jabbed Greg in the shoulder. Greg was in similar spirits. As the chieftain continued, he said something along the lines of, "Oh yes, the entire village has learned to love the white men." We told Amy later after she woke up, and she was a little jealous. We told her it was going through two translators. They definitely meant all of us. It just got lost in translation. I had a binder full of notes already, and I spent the rest of the day adding to it, but I decided I'd leave it back in the hut during the party. I could fill in some stuff about the sister tribesmen and the celebration from memory, and it wasn't long before darkness had fallen and the party was on. Even more culture to write about. The fire in the center of the town was twice as tall as either of the other nights. They danced and played music, and we drank a sweet alcohol they made from fermented fruits. It was a few hours of good times and dancing. I had forgotten about the man from the sister tribe was even supposed to attend. Suddenly though, out of the darkness of the brush, the horn sounded again. This time, much closer than I had heard it the other day. The locals cheered in unison as they scrambled to their seats around the fire. The chieftain gathered us outsiders up and pushed us to our seats, a big goofy drunken smile on his face the whole time. Everyone but Miguel, that is. He had taken him out in front of the fire and excitedly announced something. What it was, I couldn't guess. I looked back over towards where the sound of the horn was coming from, and I was suddenly confused. There was a pair of white poles just on the tree line. Where did those come from? I looked back over to Miguel and then the chieftain, and they were still carrying on. I thought it wouldn't be much of a welcome for the guest of honor. Again, I looked back to the trees and the white poles. They connected at the top and kept going. My eyes followed the structure up further and was met by a colossal face looking at the fire. Those weren't poles. They were legs. A giant 30-foot tall thing stood on the tree line. It was lit only by the giant fire, but I could make out enough. Its skin was eggshell white. For how tall it was ghastly how skinny it was. It stood there only in a loincloth, as its troubling human eyes stared at the dancing fire. Its hair dropped to its shoulders and matched its ghostly white skin, and his mouth on his elongated head hung open limply. I couldn't figure out how to comprehend what I was looking at, let alone point it out. It stood there silently for about a minute, watching Miguel and the chieftain and the fire. Suddenly it stepped out into the open, and everyone now turned to it. I was still stunned, speechless. It reached towards the fire, and Miguel, he was the last one to notice it. He didn't even get a chance to get a good look at it before the thing's fingers were around him. Miguel screamed as he was hoisted into the air as he finally got a good look at it. Amy, Greg, and I were all completely thunderstruck. The locals looked on with bated breath. Miguel did his best to struggle and scream, but he was only in the thing's grasp for a few seconds. before it tightened, and he went limp. The locals went wild in celebration. An absolutely cry of glee rang out. We looked on in horror as the ghostly white skeleton of a man turned around and trudged back into the forest, Miguel's corpse still in hand. None of the locals even watched it leave. They just laughed and drank and danced even harder than they already had been. I think it was Amy who came to her sense first. The next minute or so was a blur, but I know we were running through the woods. I ran harder than I ever had. I don't know if any of the islanders followed us. I couldn't hear anything. It was like my body put all of its resources into running. We got back to the boat in what had to be under a minute. Full throttle out of there. I would have paddled too if I had an oar. We circled around the side of the island on the way back to the mainland. I looked back to the island that Miguel died on. One of them stepped on the beach, and in the moonlight, looked back at me. Maybe 12 years old, wearing a leash attached to one of those dog training collars with the inward-facing spikes. She was sitting on the balcony of my neighbor's apartment, her dirty bare legs dangling through the iron bars. She stared at me where I sat with my book on my own balcony, so I gave her a little wave. She didn't so much as blink in return. She just kept swinging her legs through the bars and staring. I figured the collar was some kind of ironic fashion accessory, although it hardly matched with her threadbare summer dress. 5 minutes later, she was still staring, and I was beginning to feel a little uncomfortable. I set my book down and asked, "What's your name, Missy?" "He calls me Cheesy," she replied, flashing all her little teeth like she was posing for a picture. "That's an unusual name, 'cause he says I make him sick like cheese." Oh, I looked down at my book. How the hell was I supposed to reply to that? "Are we friends now?" she asked, squishing her face between the bars. "Okay, friends." I couldn't help but smile at her innocent charm. "Can I call you something other than cheesy, though?" "He also calls me Cockroach," she chirped conversationally. "Little freak. Shitface. Who calls you these things? Your father?" But she didn't get a chance to reply. A vicious tug on the leash tightened the spikes into her throat. Her fingers clutched at it, but she couldn't loosen the grip. A moment later, and she was helplessly reeled back inside her apartment. I ran to the edge to look, but my view was obstructed by the jutting concrete which separated the balconies. I just saw her being dragged inside, and then heard, "What did I tell you about talking to strangers?" He asked me a question. "I knew it was a mistake to let you outside." The sliding glass door slammed. I couldn't make out anything after that. My stomach felt like I'd just eaten a pound of garbage. I've never spoken to my neighbor before. A severe, quiet man who wore dark sunglasses inside and out. I didn't even know he had a kid. He didn't seem like the type, although there's a chance she wasn't even his. Either way, I called Child Protective Services to let them decide. They thanked me for the information and said they would send someone over. I walked around the rest of the day feeling like a hero. I had a few errands to run, but I got back just in time to see an authoritative black woman in a prism blue suit standing outside my neighbor's open door. "I'm sorry, there must have been some mistake," he said from inside his apartment. "I live alone, no kids." "My apologies, I must have gotten the wrong address," she said. "Would you mind if I take a peek inside, just so I can check off my forms?" The pause was slightly too long. "No, that's not okay. This is my home, my sanctuary. Go bother someone else. It'll only take a few." The door slammed shut. The woman immediately began knocking again, but there was no response. "Excuse me, CPS?" I asked. She looked me up and down as though evaluating my potential to be a scumbag. "You the guy who called?" she asked. I nodded. "What's your next step?" "My next step? What's your next step?" she snapped. "I don't have any next steps without a signed warrant from a judge, and I'm not going to get that without some evidence. You get a picture or anything?" I shook my head. "Well, call me if you do." She was already halfway to the elevator. "That's it?" "What do you mean, that's it? I got 3 more cases tonight, and chances are at least one of them isn't going to be so pretty as this. I got a job to do, honey, but I can't do it here." Sounds like I had a job to do too. He couldn't stay in there forever, right? Either he'd leave with her and I could follow them, or he'd leave alone and I'd had the chance to talk with her and find out what was going on. I brought my book into the hallway and sat down to wait. Half an hour did the trick. The door opened and sunglasses gave a quick, paranoid scan. They landed on me. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Lost my key." I lied. "Gotta wait for my roommate to get home." He disappeared back inside and the door closed. I thought I missed my chance, but a moment later, the door opened again and he exited with Cheesy. She was still wearing the collar, but the leash was bundled up, and he rested his hand on her shoulder so it was barely visible. As they passed, she glanced back at me as if to say, "Goodbye, friend," but it wasn't goodbye yet. I followed them out of the building while pretending to stare at my phone, but I couldn't get a clear shot of the collar. I snapped one of them together, but that didn't seem like enough for a warrant yet. I might feel like a masquerading pillar of vigilante justice, but I certainly wasn't as smooth as one. By the time the pair had gotten to their car, the man must have noticed me a dozen times. The chase was on. We'd only been out in the night for about 5 minutes when he suddenly pulled off the road into a dirt clearing beside some cornfields. I was so caught up in the excitement that I hadn't even paused to consider what I would do when I actually caught them. He must have known his secret was out though, and if something happened to the girl tonight, I'd never forgive myself. I pulled off the road and parked behind him while dialing 911. "Put the phone down." The man had gotten out of his car. He walked around to the passenger side to drag the girl out by the leash. The powerful yanks sent a clear signal about who would pay the price if I didn't obey. I hung up and got out of the car. "Did I tell you to get out?" he barked. "Back in, keep driving." "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, vainly hoping to draw some attention to our dark road. The man flinched at the sound. "Where do you get off putting a collar on? If you knew her, you'd do the same, or worse," he growled, his hands turning white from clenching the leash so hard. "This little freak deserves it." "Daddy, I can't breathe," the girl whimpered. "Shut your disgusting mouth." I couldn't take it anymore. I barreled headlong into the man, throwing him against his car. One of his arms was tangled in the leash, and that gave me a chance to pin his free arm and punch him across the face. The man slid to the ground, dragging the girl with him as she clutched at her collar and howled. I couldn't divert my attention long enough to unfasten the collar, so I just stomped on the man's hand that was holding the leash. "Goddamn idiot," he shouted. "Do you have any idea how long it took me to capture her in the first place? Now look what you've done." I did look, and damn, was I proud. The man lay there nursing his hand while I unfastened the collar from around the girl's neck. She was grinning from ear to ear. "I'm going to call the police now," I warned him, stripping his wallet and ID. "You better stay put unless you want the collar on you." "Don't bother," he moaned. "We'll both be dead before they arrive." An idle threat from a desperate man, or so I thought, until I glanced back at Cheesy. I guess I hadn't noticed how long her neck was under the metal collar, at least twice as long as a neck ought to be, and it was growing by the second. I swallowed hard, but it felt like there was cotton in my throat. "What are you waiting for?" the man shouted, all pretense of discretion gone. "Run!" The neck was still stretching. Her figure stayed the same. Her face was all smiles. but her neck was almost as long as her whole body now. It twisted sinuously through the air as though it had no bones at all, stretching luxuriously after its confinement. Little Freak wasn't such a bad name. Did you know that most of their body is a hollow cavity which stores their folded neck? Or that the silver collars were the only way to keep them from extending? I certainly didn't. Not until I read the papers stuffed in his wallet. Not before I stood in shocked awe on the side of the road and watched her jaw unhinge to consume him whole. Police dispatch, what is your emergency? Faintly droned my phone. Friends? I asked the girl. She nodded, choking the man's still squirming body into her grotesquely swollen neck. Friends, I repeated as I hung up the phone. Backing into my car, her eyes watched me while she continued to gag the body down. Well, shit. So much for being a hero, but at least I was still a hero to her. The fun thing about having rich friends is that you'll probably be able to experience things that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. But there's always a downside. Your rich friends will meet a lot of people. They may also befriend these people and invite them to the same parties they invite you to. Now, it's not like I'm antisocial or anything. I'm alright with meeting new people. But not every person you meet will always be that one you'll want to see again. Some people are too different personality-wise. Some people are straight up dangerous. And sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, you'll question if they're even a person at all. My friend Jason's dad does something related to real estate in Florida. He's a big deal over there. So big that Jason could effectively act with impunity regarding funds. But he doesn't. Jason's not a troublemaker, nor is he a complete dick. He studies hard and drives a Toyota Camry. A model son for a rich guy, so to speak. A model son except for one thing. His partying habits. Twice a month he'll go ballistic, throwing insane parties in hotel suites, renting out luxury Airbnbs for a night, and since we live in Miami, taking out his dad's yacht for a few days. I was invited to his most recent yacht party. At first, he didn't tell us how many people were coming, but he made it sound like there weren't many. I suppose that 16 isn't quite a lot, but I was still surprised when we showed up. It isn't a tiny yacht by all means, but 16 people put into borderline crowded territory, plus I knew there were only 8 beds. He justified this by saying, 8 beds and 8 girls. You can't mess this up. Consequently, there were 8 guys as well. Besides Jason, I was only familiar with 2 others. Mike, one of my closer friends, and Chad, who I kinda knew through various connections, but never really talked for extended periods of time. We left at 4 p.m. on a Friday, planning to dock again on Sunday morning. 2 full nights of partying. If I said that I wasn't excited, that would have been a blatant lie. Right as we were about to leave, one of the girls tried to convince Jason to bring along 2 of her friends with them. Jason agreed, but probably only because they were hot. And then he told me something concerning, that he only directly knew 8 of the people who were coming. The rest were just tag-alongs. But again, since most of them were girls, he just decided to allow it. Not the smartest move on his part, but I'm sure he thought that this meant a 3-way was in the works for him. In any case, we finally set out. We weren't going very far, and Jason was pretty much an expert in piloting this thing, so I wasn't incredibly worried in that regard. But there were probably 240 beers, 5 bottles of rum, and 12 grams of weed on the boat, which probably meant trouble down the line. I wish we ran into that kind of trouble as opposed to what actually happened. There were now 18 people, and it was a bit crowded, but that didn't stop it from being a blast. We went deep into the night, and I think I saw some other drugs come out right before I blacked out. Admittedly, I probably went too hard, because my memories after 10 p.m. were pretty fuzzy. I guess I blew my chance at getting laid as well, because I was literally in the bathtub when I woke up. I pulled myself up and began scavenging for some cold juice. I noticed that all the bedroom doors were closed, and there were only 4 other people in similar positions to me, still passed out in obscure places. Neither Jason, Mike, nor Chad were amongst them. I finally found some juice and decided to sit on the deck, soaking in the 75 Fahrenheit Miami weather. I noticed a girl lying on a lawn chair across from me, reading a book. I didn't recognize her, but along with passing out early, I didn't really get acquainted with everybody to begin with, so that was to be expected. I made my way over to the chair beside her and introduced myself. "Eric," I said as I shook her hand. "Don't think we've met yet." She smiled. "My name's Sarah, and no, we haven't. Didn't really get a chance since you died so early last night." Slightly embarrassed, I just chuckled back. "Yeah, I'll probably tone it down tonight." We sat and talked for a bit before everybody else started waking up, or finishing up their morning routines. After that, we all just hung out, playing pool, darts, taking dips in the ocean, and just having a good time. Somebody pointed out the fact that we couldn't see the shore anymore, even though we definitely could last night. Jason just laughed it off. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I know what I'm doing." Truth be told, I really wasn't worried about it. We'd gone out further before, and he never had trouble getting us back. Problem is, things got truly concerning once we decided to set up a beer pong tournament. There should have been 9 even teams, given that there were 18 of us on the boat, and there were 9 teams plus 1 extra person. There was no need to recount it or anything. 19 people. The anomaly was right there in front of us. Most of us just wrote it off as nothing, but Jason looked worried. "No," he said. "I made a list of everybody who was coming, even Lacey's 2 friends who got on just before. There should be 18 exactly." There were a few more protests trying to convince him that this meant nothing, but they were sparse. If you took just a second to think about it, there was obviously something wrong here. "All right," somebody called out. "Who's the stowaway?" Nobody stepped up, of course. I asked Jason if he had everybody's name written down. He said that he did, but couldn't match each name to each face, since most of them were strangers to him. "If you somehow snuck onto this yacht, step up," Jason called out. "Look, I'm not mad. It's pretty impressive how you did that. I'll let you stay. I just want to know." Nobody still. "Well, you had your chance. If I find you now, I'm throwing you off right here. I'm calling out everybody's names." Jason took out the list of people who were supposed to be here and began reading them off. About 5 in, he calls out a name and nobody answers. I saw him squint down at the paper before letting out an exasperated exhale. "This is not my list," he said. "Somebody fucked with my list." I looked and confirmed it for myself. My name wasn't even on it. We had to try something else. What followed next was a painful process of going through each person and trying to figure out who knew who. As expected, it became a messy process trying to narrow down the culprit. Shit escalated when one of the girls let out a scream. You'd think this would indicate a distraction attempt, and that the person who didn't belong had just revealed herself. But she was one of the people that Jason actually knew beforehand, so that wasn't the case. "What the heck, Nikki?" Jason said to her. Still looking rattled, she pointed to the water below. "There was a person down there." Once she said that, nearly everybody rushed over at once to take a look, but there was nobody. We looked for about 10 minutes, but nobody ever came up. Nikki still stuck to her story, claiming that some dude was treading in the water, staring up at her. But even if she was telling the truth, what were we supposed to do about it? The option that yielded the most peace of mind was simply writing it off as her eyes playing tricks on her. So that's what we did. We settled everybody down and went back to the process of elimination. It took a few hours, but we finally managed to come to a conclusion. But it wasn't one that we were expecting. Everybody had been accounted for. Jason counted to make sure, and there were indeed 18 people now. Thinking the stray had ran off when Nikki screamed, Jason told everybody to stay right where they were, while him and I searched the boat. Eventually, we found a dude still sleeping in one of the rooms. This is it, we thought to ourselves. The stray had escaped and was now pretending to sleep. Neither of us recognized him either, so this only put fuel on the fire of suspicion. We woke him up and confronted him. As expected, he defended himself, stating that his friend Laura had invited him. There was only one way to prove whether or not he was bullshitting. We had to ask Laura ourselves. We marched him out onto the deck and asked if anybody knew him. Laura and one other girl said yes, putting us back to where we started. Hold on, Jason told everybody, sounding more frustrated than ever. He walked around and did another body count, now including the person who'd been sleeping. Still 18, he said. Did you guys not see anybody walking off? They all shook their heads. You gotta be fucking kidding me, he said. Okay, well now we know that everybody here right now are the ones who are supposed to be here. So stay still while I take a picture of everybody's face. Afterwards, we went around and took one more look throughout the boat. Nobody. We did another head count as well. 18. At the very least, things were momentarily stable. Remembering who didn't belong would have been much easier if we hadn't spent most of our time high or drunk. Also, if half the girls here didn't look the same, Jason had a type after all. By this point, it was around 6 p.m., and with everything that had happened, nobody was really in the partying mood. By the time 9 p.m. had rolled around, more than half of us had decided to just sleep. The ones who remained, including Jason and I, cracked open a few beers to calm our nerves. We put on some low-volume music and started playing cards. As it started getting dark, I decided to go over to the front of the boat in order to grab a picture of the sunset. As I was trying to get my phone camera to focus, I heard a thump coming from below me. I looked down and nearly fainted. One of those smaller, two-person fishing boats was bumping against the front of the yacht. Nobody inside. I told everybody what I'd seen, but they had no idea how to react to the news. It all seemed to add up. The extra person in our group, the man in the water, and now the boat. But once you start factoring in the weird-ass details, it starts making less sense. Now on high alert, we decided to just watch a movie on Jason's laptop. There was obviously an obscure tension in the air, but we opted to ignore it. We were going home soon. At this point, it was completely dark outside, and besides the moon, our only source of illumination were the deck lights. Eventually, somebody got up in order to use the washroom. I didn't see who it was. They seemed to finish up rather quickly, returning only a few minutes later and sitting down beside me. And then, a few minutes after that, another person came onto the deck. Guys, a familiar voice asked, "Who the hell is that?" It wasn't the person beside me who asked. It was the person who had just arrived. The question made my heart drop. Nobody moved, and I didn't dare to look at whatever was sitting beside me. If they were a real human being, they would have spoken up. I could hear it breathing, with this weird staccato rhythm of exhales that made my skin crawl. I sat there, deathly still for what felt like hours, and then the thing beside me started cackling, like some fucking demon from another dimension. It was high-pitched and rapid, almost like a chittering of some kind. The cackling quickly developed into what sounded like gurgling, and that's when I broke. I flipped shit and started running. So did everybody else. I began trying to barge into every room, but they were all locked. I ended up just locking myself in a bathroom. Probably a selfish decision, but I was in self-prevention mode. I could hear them still running around outside, screaming and banging on doors. The worst thing about this was the fact we didn't even know what the hell we were running from. I stayed put until things began settling down, until the scattered screams and rapid footsteps had ceased. I checked my phone. 3:11 a.m. If it was now calm out there, then that meant one of two things. Either everybody found a hiding spot or, well, you know. Eventually, sleep got the better of me. I remember waking up to somebody banging on the bathroom door. I was startled at first, but then I heard Jason's voice. "Whoever's in there, we're fucking leaving." I checked the time on my phone. 7:35 a.m. I opened the door and stumbled out, realizing that we docked. We were back on land. Jason was pacing around, still knocking on every door and telling everybody to come out. Apparently, he had locked himself in the cockpit during the confusion and brought us back during the night. We ended up doing another head count. Still 18. After a brief sigh of relief, we all got the hell off the boat, nobody taking a glance back. As I walked with Jason towards his car, we didn't say a single word. Even while he was driving me back to my house, we remained silent. But as we pulled in my driveway and I was about to lock myself in my room forever, he stopped me. I memorized everybody's face last night. Even though I counted 18, I only recognized 16 of them. It took my brain a second to process what this meant, but even when it did, I still found it hard to respond. I didn't know what to do, was the last thing that he said to me before driving off. Fuck the ocean. I live in a small but lively town in Massachusetts. Its local legends have fueled my love affair with the paranormal. It's a subject that fascinates me to this day. Coupled with insomnia, this passion led me to spend many nights at a nearby cemetery, hoping to see a ghostly apparition while walking through to pass the time. These outings were unfruitful, void of all activity, supernatural or otherwise. My dream of stealing a glimpse at what comes after eventually subsided, but I continued to visit the graves. It was a place where I could collect my thoughts when sleep eluded me. One night, however, something changed. It was a dark spring evening. I was bored, couldn't sleep, and felt the need to do something outdoors in the cool night air. As it so often did, the local graveyard called out to me. I obliged, unable to resist the allure of its calming nature. Sometimes, I was even tempted to set up camp there and sleep amongst the dead. Knowing this would be frowned upon and perhaps morbid, I settled for my walks. They were enough to make me at least somewhat weary by night's end. After a couple of hours there, I decided on one last stroll along the headstones, an attempt to become tired before heading home. Upon starting my walk, I noticed something. There was a light on in the groundkeeper's shack. It wasn't like him to be working so late. This wasn't completely out of the ordinary until you factored in the large gaping hole nearby, big enough for several caskets. It was a miracle I hadn't fallen into it earlier in the night. Curious as to what the old man was up to, I crept over to the shack, making my way to the busted window on its side. What I saw was strange. Inside were 9 men wearing tattered blue shrouds, partaking in a makeshift feast. The main course was an oily red stew with a horrific smell that permeated the shack's walls and ventured up my nasal passages, tempting me to gag. The men winced when putting it to their lips, save for 3, a tall man at the end of the table and the 2 sat beside him. When the feast was over, this tall figure stood up and addressed the room. "Hello, newcomers. I hope dinner has been to your liking." He spoke with a firm voice. It resonated throughout the shack and beckoned even me to listen. "Now that our bellies are full, Elijah will explain the rules of your impending trial." I listened closely. It seemed the men in the shack were part of a collective known as the Bloodlights. The trial the tall man spoke of was something akin to the medieval gladiator sport used to initiate new members. I listened on as Elijah divulged the game's inner workings. Fearful but curious. 2 teams were to disappear to opposite sides of the cemetery, each consisting of 4 members, 3 blood runners, and 1 blood baron. The initiates would be the runners, and the tall man's henchmen would act as barons. There was one more participant to be discussed. The tall man himself. He was the blood keeper, Though not on either team, he was the most crucial facet of the game. He kept and guarded what was referred to as the blood. I gathered that this referred to the red amulet hanging from the keeper's neck, as he firmly grabbed it every time the word blood was uttered. The job of the runners was to retrieve the blood from the keeper. The barons acted as counsel, overseeing each team and helping where needed. After Elijah finished his lecture, the blood keeper took over. With every wound, there is blood. With every drop of blood, there is solace. Without death, there can't be no light. The keeper opened a large cupboard in the corner of the shack, revealing a woman, bound and gagged, futilely attempting to cry out for help. My heart sank. This was not your normal, run-of-the-mill cult ritual. I had to find help. But what if they heard me? Unable to nail down my next course of action, I was immobile, frozen in fear. The blood keeper continued. The light of blood can only be seen in death. Pulling a large red dagger out from his cloak, he grabbed the woman and plunged it into her gut. I watched in horror as the life left her eyes. She began to shriek, but was soon cut off by a cut to the chest, followed by a final blow to her neck. I was mortified. After throwing his kill to the floor, the keeper pulled out 3 vials, filling each of them with the blood that dripped from his blade. This was the blood the runners were after, not the amulet. This is all the blood I have to offer. That gives, at most, 3 of you the opportunity to become bloodlights. And remember, you are being watched. Those who fail to collect must be disposed of. The same goes for any outsider you encounter. Corpses are to be thrown in the pit. Dear God, I was truly in danger. That's what the nearby hole was for, the perfect hiding spot for mass grave. You must stop at nothing to obtain one of these vials. All others will be sacrificed. Your thirst for blood must be as strong as your will to live. The men exited the shack to begin the trial. I scurried silently to the wooden part of the graveyard and hid behind a large tree, not wanting to end up like that poor woman. I just needed an opening to escape without being noticed. Glancing out at the cemetery, I saw a runner knelt before a grave, eyes closed. I assumed this was a requirement before the game commenced, a perfect chance for me to make my run for it. Let the trial begin. The bloodkeeper's voice echoed through the trees before I could take even a single step towards safety. My survival still hung in the balance. Using a moonlit pool of water by my feet as a reflective surface, I watched as Elijah and 3 runners strategized just 10 yards from my position. My heart was pounding so hard, I was worried they would hear it. Between the beating in my chest and the conspiring whispers that filled the forest, my ears were consumed with an unsettling symphony of torture. Just when I couldn't bear another moment, silence cut through the brisk night air like the keeper's dagger piercing that woman's skin. A chill then burrowed into my spine. The puddle's reflection bore no cloaked figures. Peering out from behind the tree confirmed that they were gone, or at least, nowhere to be seen. This was my chance. Looking off into the distance, I saw a tomb by the main road. Maybe 100 yards away, it would provide the perfect cover to escape towards civilization. But there was no way I could waltz over there without being seen. The woods wrapped around the cemetery, so running from tree to tree would strengthen my odds of survival. I took a deep breath and braced myself. Without so much as a second thought, I dashed to the next tree on the path to safety and took cover. I then gathered my wits and surveyed my surroundings. No cloaks in sight. I sprinted to the next tree and took another glimpse out at the world. The coast was still clear. As I was about to take off in the direction of my next hiding spot, panic set in as my feet inexplicably left solid ground. My blood ran cold as I was lifted into the air by some unseen force. The next thing I knew, my body was hoisted up and placed atop a tree branch. There, I was greeted by the unnerving sight of my captor, a blood runner. I didn't scream or try to get away. It would be no use. I sat there in terror and exhaled what I thought would be my last breath. Instead of gutting me, the man spoke. "What's your name?" I was too shocked to respond. "Come on now, who are you?" He spoke clear this time, revealing a slight English accent. "Look, I noticed you at the window over there, eavesdropping. If I wanted you dead, I could have killed you then. I want you to help me." "Help you?" I asked. "Yes, I'm going to use you to my advantage. I take it you know what we're doing here, and you know the rules of the game." I nodded slowly, still shook. "Good. With you, I may be able to turn the tables and get the upper hand." I was frightened, but I calmed down enough to focus on the runner's plan. "See that tomb over there? That's where the Bloodkeeper is." My stomach turned. To think, this guy may have just saved my life. "I need you to go over to the tomb and open the door slowly. The Bloodkeeper will surely take a swing at you. Just as he's about to end your life, I'll swoop in and end his." "But why?" I asked. "That's not part of the game." "Right you are. You should not concern yourself with the why. Just know that if you don't do as I say, I will kill you myself. Now get going." The man gave me his cloak for protection and pushed me out of the tree. I didn't want to risk facing the Bloodkeeper, but I didn't want to perish at the runner's hands either. My fear of dying kept me from deviating. I again ran from tree to tree, eventually making it to my destination, the stench of bloodshed wafting through the air as runners fought for control of the field. With my back pressed to the cold, aged stone, the pull to escape grew. The main road was within reach, but the thought quickly subsided. I was far too worried the Englishman would catch up to me and take his price. He was able to climb a tree and lift my weight into it without a sound. It was clear he possessed the agility and strength needed to take me by surprise during a haphazard run for the hills. I sighed in defeat, knowing that one way or another, I would probably die that night. Mustering up every bit of courage I had left, I crept around the tomb and faced its door. My shaking hands reached for the rusted handle and pulled it towards me. Before its hinges could even crack at the motion, the door burst open, pushed from within. The force knocked me over, my head connecting with the unforgiving ground. The moments that came after remained fuzzy. The Bloodkeeper towered over me, half his blood in shadow, the other soaked in moonlight. A vision of death there to steal the blood from my racing heart. My eyes grew weary and shut for an instant before opening to see another figure. I couldn't make out who was who in my dazed state, but one attacked the other, completely overpowering them. The prey in this scuffle fell to his knees before landing face first into the cold cemetery soil. The familiar sound of metal colliding with flesh rang through the air as the victor saw to it that the job was done. I prayed it was the Bloodkeeper being torn apart. Otherwise, I was a goner. My eyes shut again before unconsciousness finally took hold. "Hey, are you alright?" I heard an old man's voice as I came to. "Are you okay?" I opened my eyes to see who it was. The groundskeeper stood over me, holding a lantern to my face. "What? How? Where are they?" "Where's who?" he asked. "You don't understand. I should be dead." The groundskeeper stared at me, confused, but then smiled. "Come on, you'll catch a cold out here." The groundskeeper, who I know now to be Pete, invited me into his shack. He prepared some food and tossed me a blanket to keep warm. Thankful and in need of an ear to fill, I told him everything, despite how I knew it would sound. I didn't describe the men by their given titles, but Pete seemed to know who I was talking about. "Sounds like you had a run-in with the Bloodkeeper." "That's him. How did you know?" "His spirit has been visiting these grounds for over 100 years now. I suppose. His spirit, incredible. It was all a haunting, something I always thought I wanted to experience firsthand. Pete and I talked for a long while. He knew all about the Bloodlights and their dastardly deeds. Apparently, they were a sadistic cult that formed in the 1800s, terrorizing the local community. Each Bloodlight initiation brought with it more disappearances. They used the cemetery as a space for their trials, burying casualties and sacrifices at the end of every night. After all, who would look for the bodies in a graveyard? Over 50 souls fell victim to the Bloodlights before their sinister games were brought to a halt. During their last outing, an Englishman infiltrated their ranks and killed the Bloodkeeper, avenging the death of his wife who had been murdered during one of their trials. Soon after, his disciples came forward, claiming to have been controlled by the Keeper's amulet, alleging that it had supernatural powers. No such amulet was ever recovered. After Pete explained everything, I sat in awe, dumbstruck by the whole ordeal. Had I relived that fateful night, or did I time travel and help the man fulfill his goal? I may never know what happened that day, but one thing is certain. I will never visit another cemetery for as long as I live, just in case the ghost of the Bloodkeeper is still out there, making his rounds. I'll never forget the screams. It was a warm spring night in the late 90s, and we were on our way home from our little cabin in the woods. It was old, musty, and a bit dilapidated, but had been in the family for generations, and monthly trips were a well-ingrained family tradition. My dad described it as a good place to unplug from technology and the world, and it was just that. Passing through that rickety screen door was like stepping into another era, despite the lack of modern-day comforts like plumbing or air conditioning. I had always enjoyed the cabin. If my family values one thing, it's tradition. The only complaint I'd ever had about the cabin was a hard time sleeping when I was younger. It wasn't necessarily the ever-present chorus of wildlife, buzzing insects, chirping birds, squirrels crashing through the underbrush. It wasn't my youthful imagination running wild with growling wolves, monstrous bears, or mysterious creatures crashing towards the flimsy walls of the cabin in the dead of the night. What kept me awake was the soft scratching I could always hear underneath the floorboards. It wasn't aggressive, and it wasn't loud. It was persistent, the faint but incessant grinding against the grainy wooden planks. As a young child, I would call out to my mother at night, afraid. She'd sit at my bed and run a hand through my hair reassuringly. "There's no need to be scared, baby. That's just Andy. He wants to come out to play. Just ignore him." This had been a good weekend. The lake was warm enough for swimming, and the fishing was great. This had been a special trip. My high school graduation celebration. We drove home under a bright moon, and I was comfortably leaning my head against a cool glass window. My parents' conversation fading into a dull drone as the streetlights zipped by. I faded in and out, closing my eyes and drifting toward off. The blast of a horn and a devastating explosion violently ripped me from sleep, and nothing would ever be the same again. I was spinning. Broken glass shards flew through the air, tearing, slicing. My mother was screaming. I will never forget those screams. There was blood. The car rolled in what felt like slow motion, finally smashing against a telephone pole and coming to rest. And then, with a gut-wrenching finality, it was over. A dizziness overtook my senses, and blackness blossomed everywhere. I was vaguely aware that I was bleeding, and I felt an intense pressure in my head. It took me a few moments to realize I was hanging upside down, held in by my seatbelt. I could smell the burning stench of deployed airbags and gasoline fumes. "Call 911. The unfamiliar voice sounded like it was underwater. I could hear boots crunching against broken glass. Consciousness began to fade. Mom? My mouth was filled with copper-tasting blood and I coughed. I couldn't quite comprehend what I was seeing. My parents lay motionless in front of me. My mom looked wrong. Her neck was sickeningly twisted in a direction that isn't possible. Her torso pointed forward, still neatly seatbelted in, but her face was staring directly at me. Her lifeless eyes were wide open, lips twisted in a silent, terrible scream. The car had crumpled in such terrific fashion at the driver's side that I couldn't see my father at all. There was thick, congealed blood and bits of hair that had been forced out of the twisted metal frame against the pavement. The best way I can describe it is if you'd set a tube of toothpaste on the floor and stomp on it. I could see shiny white bits amidst the carnage, and I tried to force myself to not recognize it as pieces of my father's skull. I stared at my dead mother's face for a long time. I couldn't look away. It wasn't until I could hear the screeching of the jaws of life opening the twisted wreck of the car that consciousness faded. There must be some kind of mistake, I said dumbly. I don't have a brother. The attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I'm afraid not, and I do apologize for being unfamiliar with your family dynamic. However, the wording is quite clear. We sat in a downtown office suite that overlooked a main thoroughfare through massive glass windows. Can you read it for me again? My head was spinning. I desire that should I die, it is my wish to be buried according to the rites of the Roman Catholic Church and interred at... Skip down to the next line. He cleared his throat. To my esteemed children, Ethan and Andrew, give and bequeath the following properties to wit. Our cabin location at... He rattled off the address and continued to name bank accounts, the family house, and other assets in official-sounding legalese. I don't have a brother. I don't know who Andrew is, I repeated. The attorney looked sympathetic and slightly awkward as he adjusted his necktie. I understand, Ethan. My investigators are attempting to ascertain this Andrew's whereabouts. He set the papers down on his desk and stared at me. This isn't the first time I have seen an unconventional family dynamic. Why your parents chose not to tell you about your brother is a question I cannot answer, but surely there's a plausible reason. Andy, I muttered. My hands began to tremble. As summer faded into fall and fall into winter, I began to obsess about the existence of Andrew and my mother's explanation of the scratching underneath the cabin. That's just Andy. He wants to come out and play. I had to see for myself. I had to know. I drove southbound under a full moon, clenching my teeth as I passed the mile marker where the crash had occurred. I turned onto the small dirt road that held the cabin. Gravel and dirt spit behind my car into the darkness. All the cabins were all empty at this time of year. No one vacations in the dead of winter. Skeletal tree branches clawed and scraped the side of my car as I pulled up the narrow driveway leading through the choked woods and up to the cabin. The small log cabin had none of its charm that it held in springtime. In the dead of this cold winter night, illuminated by nothing but my Chevy's headlights, it looked menacing, haunting. I clicked on my flashlight and tucked it under an armpit as I fumbled with the keys. My breath frosted in the frigid air. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I stopped and listened closely. It was there, faint but present, soft scratching from underneath the floorboards. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and my heart began to beat faster. A heavy padlock secured the small door leading to the crawl space underneath the cabin. A little key accompanied the larger front door key on the keyring. It slid into the padlock easily. The little door groaned as I pulled inward, and the padlock clattered to the floor. A stench assaulted my senses, and I fought to keep my lunch down. It stank of rotten meat. It stank of death. My heart beat even faster. The small flashlight cast a pitiful beam of yellow light into the icky blackness that stretched downward, into the bowels of the cabin. The wooden steps creaked and groaned under my feet as I descended underground, the beam of light now trembling wildly across the moldy walls and uneven dirt floor. Tree roots protruded in some areas. The ceiling of the crawlspace was crisscrossed, with thousands of shallow gouges and scratches. As I gagged on the foul odor, the beam of my flashlight illuminated the creature in a sickly yellow light. It sat on its haunches deep in the shadowed recesses of the crawlspace. I froze. Bile rose into the back of my throat, and blackness emmed into my vision as adrenaline dumped. It softly scratched on the ceiling with bony fingers that were too long. Its skin, white as curdled milk and horribly smooth, glowed against the flashlight. It didn't seem to notice me as it continued its relentless scratching on the ceiling with bloody and worn-down fingertips. Its ribs jutted out from malnutrition. It was vaguely human in composition, but at the same time, totally otherworldly. Its eyes were completely white, like a cave-dwelling beast. I gagged again, and that's when it noticed me. It snapped toward me, enlarged nostrils flaring angrily. I could hear a barely perceptible sniffing as it cocked its head and scrambled toward me at an astonishing speed. It used its hands as much as its legs in the cramped confines of the crawlspace, as a gorilla would. The way it moved was all wrong. It was fluid but primitive, like some kind of reptile. I screamed again, dropping the flashlight and scrambling up the staircase. I could hear a soft grunt as the creature hit the stairs, only a few feet behind me and closing the distance fast. That thing was so terribly quiet. A cold, wet hand wrapped around my ankle like an eel. I felt another massive adrenaline dump, and I lashed out with my free foot, catching the creature in its head. It tumbled down the staircase silently, the blackness totally enveloping it. I plunged out of the crawlspace, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, breathing heavily. "Dad," my son called from the bedroom. It had been many years since my encounter with Andy, and try as I might, I simply could not connect the dots as to why my parents had kept my deformity of a brother hidden away in a crawlspace, imprisoned, their dirty secret. I went to my son's bed and sat down, his little frame not even taking up half the bed. Moonlight spilled through the open window, illuminating the room. "Shh," I said as I ran a reassuring hand through his hair. "Dad, the scratching again," he whined. "It's okay, pal," I said. "That's just Uncle Andy. He wants to play. Just ignore him. Besides, we're headed back home tomorrow." I got used to Andy's scratching, and my son would get used to it too. He settled down and fell back asleep quickly. I sat next to him for a while, listening to the soft scratching and smiling at the absurdity of it all. I think most people would have sold the cabin, or maybe burned it down to the ground, but I wasn't raised that way. I was raised with tradition, and if my family values one thing, it's tradition. I had initially brushed it off when I woke up the first morning and was greeted with the sight of my bedroom door wide open. My bed faced that door, and to avoid looking at the dark hallway that led from the room, I had always closed it before going to sleep. So, it did come as a surprise to find it open in the morning. But I could have not closed the door all the way last night. Then the draft from the AC managed to nudge it, and then the hinge caused the door to swing all the way open. It was reasonable. So, I went about my day per usual. Soon again, it was nighttime. So this time, I made sure to close my bedroom door until I heard the slight click of the lock sliding into place. Morning came once again, and as any other day besides yesterday, I woke up to my closed bedroom door. I got up, dressed for work, and headed into my living room. The door to my pantry was open. Not cracked open or half open, but so completely wide open that the door was resting as far as it could go on the connected wall. Last night, I had gone out to eat with some friends, so I know that I wasn't hungry in the evening and wouldn't have gone into the pantry. but maybe I left it open that morning when I left for work. I had gone in there yesterday morning and was a bit rushed, so I could have left it open. It was reasonable. Still, I forced myself to go about my day unfazed. The next morning, the door to my guest bedroom was wide open. I never went in there, since I barely ever had guests, and only about once every few months did I go in there to clean it. However, I happened to stop by that room the other day to grab some extra sheets. Since I rarely go down that hallway, never mind looking down it every day, I could have left it open when I grabbed the sheets and didn't realize I didn't close the door all the way. It was reasonable. The next day passed in a paranoid blur. I kept checking over my shoulder, never quite focusing what I was doing at work. Sleep didn't seem like it would come easy, so I downed a few melatonins and was out. Early next morning, I shut off my alarm and sulked about getting ready. I was still a little drowsy from the pills, but nonetheless headed out of the bedroom without delay. I was met with a slight breeze as I went further into my house. I rubbed my arms as the house seemed to grow colder and colder as I made it into the living room. My feet froze as I took sight of my front door completely open. Now, I knew I definitely did not leave the front door to my house unlocked and wide open. The only logical conclusion was that someone must have broken in, stolen some valuables I had. I phoned 911, texted my boss that I'd be late, and waited for the cops to arrive. They came shortly thereafter and immediately set to work. They investigated everything in my house from my front door to my bedroom. I sat on my living room sofa the entire time, and once they had finished, they came to join me in the conjoint love seats across. Now, the memory of the conversation is slightly fuzzy, but it went as follows almost exactly. "Miss," one of the officers began, "did you notice any valuables of yours missing? Any jewelry or maybe some money?" I had shaken my head saying, "No, I don't keep much cash in the house, and the only expensive jewelry I have is my wedding ring. Last night, I had fallen asleep with it on, since most days I couldn't bear to take it off, even though Philip and I were divorced. It remained on my finger, even now, as I typed this out. There doesn't seem to be any forced entry," the other officer began, clasping his hands in front of him. Heck, I'd even go on to say that whoever opened the front door had a key. "Are you sure you closed it last night?" "Yes." I sat up straight in my seat, annoyed that these officers would accuse me of such. "You think that I wouldn't make sure my own front door was closed before going to sleep?" One of the officers held a hand up, gesturing for me to take it easy. "Ma'am, we're just saying, there's not a single sign of a robbery. Nothing is missing or indicates a break-in." He put the hand down. "Does anyone else have keys to your house?" "No one. Just me. I bought this place after my divorce. Do you keep a key under the mat outside, or any hidden key that remains outside the house that someone could have found?" "No. I'm far too paranoid to do that." Both of the officers stood up, signaling that it was time for them to leave. They told me to retract my steps of last night and to rethink about when I think I closed my front door. Then one of them gave me their card, telling me that I can call them personally if anything else happens, since they are already familiar with my case. They probably thought I was some crazy loon who had gotten drunk and or high last night and had forgotten to close my front door. But, I mean, what other explanation is there? Is there even one? I just can't believe that I had slept through the night, unaware that my house was wide open for anyone to walk into. I ended up skipping work that day. Something was happening in my house that occurred while I slept, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. I couldn't just brush it off like before. That night, I slipped into bed. I knew that whatever was causing my doors to open only occurred while I slept. Yet when I closed my eyes, sleep wouldn't come. Maybe the fear of this situation was to keep me awake. A few hours passed, and I may have dozed off, because when I checked my clock, it was 2 a.m. This was probably a good time to check on all the doors in my house to see if anything had happened. I went to get out of my bed when something sounded outside my bedroom. It was the slightest creak of a door opening. I froze, my eyes locked on my bedroom door, my body refusing to move. It's probably just the AC nudging a door open. Soft, padded footsteps sounded in the hallway from my bedroom, thumping every so preciously. They got louder, up to the point I heard what sized being would produce that loud of footsteps on carpet. The footsteps continued, increasing in proximity. When I heard them outside my bedroom, someone was in my house. This someone must have been the one opening the doors, keen on the idea of tormenting me. Maybe some homeless person snuck into my house at one point in the last few days. I heard the faint jingle as something latched onto my doorknob. Then it was turning, and my door gave the slightest creak to let me know that it had been opened. Petrified, I remained completely still. I hastily glanced about my bedroom. I had no windows to escape out of, nothing but my phone, which was resting on my nightstand. I could call the cops, but my door would be completely open any second, and this someone could intervene the call. Who says they're not clutching a knife and prepared to take me down if necessary? This person has been about my house already while I sleep, and I figured if I pretended to be asleep, they should just leave me alone just as they did the previous nights. Immediately I grabbed my phone, flopped into bed, and pulled the covers to my chin. The minute I closed my eyes, the door wheezed and a slightly larger creak that told me it was all the way open. Then it was just silence. Whoever had opened my door was just watching me. I forced all emotion from my expression as I pretended to sleep in my bed. My phone was clutched in a death grip against my chest, my entire body going still. Suddenly, I felt the hot wisps of someone's breath on my forehead. I shot up in my bed, launching myself against my headboard. My eyes were wild, my chest struggling to move so to keep air going in and out at a steady pace. However, the air caught in my throat as my entire body froze in place. Once I caught sight of the thing that was standing at the edge of the bed, right where I had been laying. Its body was overgrown, with a slight hunch in its spine that told me it was taller than originally perceived. And I say it because there were no definable features that led me to think this thing had a gender. Sure, its body looked humanoid, with 2 arms and 2 legs, but those limbs were long and gangly, with neither arm being of equal length to the other. Its skin was wrinkled in some places, such as around its wrist and chest, but other places it looked stretched out, as if the skin were being tightly pulled against its bones. Its eyes were 2 holes gouged into its head, deep and sunken in. No eyeballs nor eyelids to showcase how this thing could even see. Above the eye holes was a thin layer of greasy hair strands, dark in color, contrasting to this thing's pale and male-formed skin, and below all of that, on its face was a thin and dried-out mouth, one that slowly stretched into a tight grin, revealing its set of black and decaying teeth. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sounds came out. My eyes were frozen on this thing. The creature took a step forward, its legs bumping against the side of my bed. It moved one of their arms backwards before they violently swung it forward, their claw hands intending to make purchase in me. I managed to flatten myself against the headboard, avoiding its swipe. My breath caught in my throat when I waited for them to do so again, since it had missed me the first time. As predicted, the thing swung its arms exactly the same as before. My earlier assumption was correct. This thing, with its sunken-in holes for eyes, must have been blind. I let a ragged breath escape my lips, relieved that I had a major advantage over this thing. But the second the breath left my lips, the thing's head snapped up to my exact location, and without a beat, it bent down on its misshapen legs and launched itself at me. By a mere second, I managed to roll over on the bed and hit the floor. I didn't waste another moment and began running. heading straight into my living room. The thing was right behind me, chasing me without so much of a hint of hesitation. It barreled through everything in my house, knocking over my coffee table and a lamp in its desperation to catch me. I sprinted to my front door, which of course was closed now. I snatched my car keys from the hook nearby and heaved the door open. I made it outside, onto my porch, and I went to slam the door shut to delay the thing, but its engorged foot stopped the door right before it could close. 2 clawed hands appeared on the side of the door, clutching the metal frame. Desperately, I still attempted to close the door when I felt the true strength of this thing as it began pushing the door back open. It was way stronger than me, easily opening the door back up despite my opposing force. Quickly, I decided that it was a lost cause. Abandoning it, I dashed to my car. Then, I began driving and didn't stop until I was a few hours out of town. The fear in my spine didn't lessen until I stopped by a motel and bought a room for the night. Even now, as I sit in this motel, typing away into this website, I pray that someone here knows what to do. I've concluded that this thing must have been living in my house all that time. Maybe in my guest room, maybe in my backyard, or maybe even squeezing itself under my bed while I slept. But it must have been looking for me, and each door it left open was its attempt to locate me. The only reason it never found me until now was due to its blindness. It had to be. Otherwise, I would be dead now the first night it was in my bedroom. I don't know if that thing is following me, or if it can. I don't know that when I do manage to go to sleep, if I'll wake up to it standing before me, my motel door wide open. I don't know, and that is what scares me most. Have you ever been in a car accident? I'm not asking about a scrape or a fender bender. I'm talking about the screech of rubber skidding so hard that you can smell it burning. When the airbag feels like a cinder block, and the blizzard of glass and shredded metal is 1,000 superheated needles searching for your skin. Every bone in your body feels like it's been replaced with twice the weight of lead. The aching throb so deep that you can't feel it right away. And the scariest thing isn't even all the blood, even though that's sprayed across every inch of twisted metal that used to be inside of your car. The scariest thing is not knowing where it's all coming from. You could be missing a leg and you wouldn't even know it. There's so much adrenaline pumping through your system that you can't even be sure whether you're still alive. And then you remember your kid who was sitting in the back, your 12-year-old son on his way home from school, sitting in the passenger side because he liked to have a clear view of the speedometer. The side where the SUV T-boned your car, crumpling it like a tin can to pin his body within the car's deformed chassis. And when the ringing in your ears finally starts to die down and you hear the crying, you're so relieved because as long as he's still alive, everything will still be okay. And it takes you a few more seconds to realize the heaving, weeping sound is actually coming from you, and that your little boy hasn't moved or made a sound. That's how it happened to me anyway. It took 2 minutes and 40 seconds for the ambulance to arrive, which I guess is pretty incredible in the big scheme of things. I was surprised when I heard the paramedic mention the number though, because I could have sworn it was at least an hour. I guess when Einstein was coming up with his theory of relativity, he neglected to mention the effect of waiting to find out whether your son is alive or dead. My son Kevin did survive though. He suffered a concussion and was knocked unconscious, but there wasn't any permanent damage. The news was such a blessing that I couldn't stop laughing when the doctor told me. His mother took a week off work to take care of him, and I really thought that everything was going to be okay, at least until the night after the accident when Kevin asked me, "You know how cartoons they get hit and see stars?" "Yeah, sure." I was trying to put him to bed, and he always asked a lot of questions whenever he was looking to stay awake a little longer. "I didn't see stars though, did you?" "No, I saw something else," he said. I'm not surprised. I drew the blankets up to his chin. "You got hit pretty hard. The doctor said your brain wasn't getting oxygen for a while, and sometimes that makes people see things. Dad, I think it saw me too. He was barely peeking out above the covers, but his eyes were huge and quivering. Well, all that matters is that you're safe now. Your mother and I aren't going to let anything... Dad, where were you before you were born? He interrupted me again. I frowned at him, hesitating. I don't think this one is addressed in the parenting handbook my wife picked up at the thrift store. I saw the place I came from, and the thing that made me. I didn't like it. What was it like? Kevin shivered, pulling the covers a little higher so that only the top of his head was showing. It made me feel small, he whispered, like a little seed falling off a big tree. That doesn't sound so bad. Trees are supposed to spread their seeds. Not this one. It was taller than anything you can imagine, with branches going from one side of the universe to the other. And there were faces under the bark. Only, it wasn't bark. It was skin. And they were screaming, or trying to. But it was like they were being suffocated by the skin. And, easy Kevin, none of that was real. And the roots were skin too. And they were squirming like worms. And there were babies in there. Only they weren't born yet. But they were screaming too. Kevin! The covers were all the way over his head now. He was breathing heavily and trembling from head to foot. I gently folded the blanket back to reveal his flushed face. He took a long breath, then said, "It hates losing its children. Hates it more than I knew anyone could hate anything. It saw me, Dad. I'm not lost anymore because it saw me, and it's not going to stop at anything until it takes me back." I didn't know what to say. I kissed him on the forehead and told him it was just a bad dream. He didn't look at me convinced, and maybe that's my fault. I didn't feel very convincing when I said it. I talked to my wife about it for a long time that night. We eventually agreed that bringing it up would only keep it fresh in Kevin's mind. Best to just forget about it and hope he does the same. He didn't speak another word on the subject for the rest of the week. He was sad and quiet, spending long hours by himself in his fort behind the house. I didn't intrude on his space or push him though. The accident was the scariest thing he's ever gone through in his life, and it was completely normal for it to take time to recover. Then on Friday, there was the note. It was written on the yellow legal pad in the kitchen we used for our grocery list. A single line in a messy scrawl that read, "I'm going back. Honey, do you need to go out again for something?" "I don't think so. Why? Do you need something?" she asked. She came around the corner and we both stared at the yellow paper. Of course, that was Kevin's handwriting. And we both stared a little longer as the same thought slowly bubbled to the surface of our minds. Then there was a thud upstairs, and that thought became a whole lot louder. "Kevin, you okay up there?" my wife shouted. Then with a smile, "Remember when we couldn't get him to stop jumping on the bed?" Thump, 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 thump. Incessant, desperate flailing. We raced each other up the stairs, the sound getting louder and louder until we flung open his bedroom door. And the sound suddenly stopped, replaced by my wife's scream. Kevin's limp body dangled from a rope, tied to a jutting piece of wood above his closet door. We rushed over to take him down, tripping over the chair he stood on before he kicked it over. The thumping had come from his legs kicking the closet door while he choked, and now they weren't moving, and time stood still again. He never lost consciousness this time though. We were all crying by the time we got the rope from around his neck. I remember saying, "You're never going to leave us. Do you understand? We belong together." He held onto us so tight that it hurt, and he was trembling all over again. "I have to go, but I'm scared to go alone," he said. "Never. Promise you won't go anywhere without me." I promise. "Wherever you go, I'll be right there with you," I said, and he hugged me even tighter. I don't know why he started laughing, or why my wife and I joined in, but I think it was just relief. Pretty soon we were all sitting on the floor together, hugging and laughing about nothing, and then it was over, and everything was going to be okay. We couldn't get him an appointment to see a psychiatrist until Monday, but he seemed more cheerful after that, and I thought things were going to get easier from there. His appetite was flourishing, and he was watching his favorite shows again. I thought that was proof that he was back to his old self. I guess when you want something badly enough, we'll look for any excuse to justify it being true. We only see what we want to see, even though it's the things we can't bear to look at that need to be seen the most. The next note came on Sunday afternoon. He wrote, "I'll be at my fort if you want to come with me this time." I didn't need to look for my wife or ponder the clue. I was out the door before the paper even drifted to the ground, sprinting as fast as I could for the woods behind the house. There was a hollow log that Kevin always used to play around. Over the span of years, we both dug out the area below it to make it his secret fort. On the outside, it just looked like a decaying log, but below, there's just enough space for 2 or 3 people to sit and hide. And all I could think about was his little body tucked away in that hole where no one would find him. About how long ago he might have written that line, and what he could have done to himself in that time. I couldn't fit inside the log to slip down the way he did. He wasn't answering my shouts, so I didn't even slow down when I hit the decaying wood. It pulverized under my weight, spraying chips and dirt in every direction. Then I was on my hands and knees, hurling away rotten chunks and pounding on the ground until it gave way underneath me. Kevin had expanded the fort a lot in the last week. I hadn't expected to fall so fast or so far. Almost 8 feet, I think. But Kevin was there and he was alright, and that's all that mattered. As long as we were together, we'd get through this. I held him close and he held me back, and everything was going to be okay. But I didn't really believe it this time, as the ground kept raining down around us. Kevin broke away from me and pulled the rope, which I hadn't noticed before. The other end was connected to a plastic tarp sitting above the hole. I didn't understand what was going on until the tarp slid forward, dumping its huge payload of dirt directly on our heads. By then, it was already too late. He buried us both alive. The tarp must have been balanced on a slope or something, because after the first pull, it just kept coming. The torrent was so dark and thick that I had to hold my breath. I got a last flash of Kevin gritting his teeth and hauling at the rope. Then he was gone, lost in the avalanche where he sealed us together. I managed to catch his hand before the dirt trapped my arm against my body. I felt the pressure of it building around my chest, then up my shoulders, packing around my neck, finally covering my head completely. The weight was so intense that I couldn't budge. I squeezed Kevin's hand and felt the pressure returned. He was holding on to me for dear life, for something dearer than life, which he'd thrown away so casually. But as the weight of earth above us increased, the pressure from his hand was fading, growing limp. I was lucky that I held my breath so quickly. My expanded lungs occupied a little more space and gave me a small pocket of air. I tried to breathe as slowly as I could, but even with the slightest intake of air, I could feel the dirt sliding in a little tighter around me, making it much harder to expel my next breath. A relentless, constricting serpent, its coils drawing tighter and tighter around my chest. I was going to die. Kevin was going to die, and I couldn't save him. But at least he wouldn't be alone. All I could do was squeeze his hand and wait for the time it didn't squeeze back. I started feeling dizzy as I labored harder and harder for air. The burning in my lungs mounted until my whole body felt like it was going to explode. And then slowly it subsided. Or maybe it was still there. But I didn't feel it so much because my consciousness was drifting off somewhere else. Somewhere else where it was still pitch black, but I didn't need my eyes to see the tree. That was what Kevin called it anyway. Although I would describe it more like a natural network, a billion tendrils connecting and separating to span across an infinite sky. Where two or more branches met, I'd see a face trapped beneath the tendril skin. All ages, all races, all expressing a myriad of human emotions. Some had jutting brows bristling with hair like a Neanderthal, while others I could have passed on the street without thinking twice. But I understand why Kevin said they were screaming. There was a sound coming from each, an infinite small note in the grand symphony which encompassed me. Many were screeching, thrashing against their confines and howling in pain. Others babbled in an unknown language, laughing or crying like raving lunatics. Still others were tranquil, softly speaking a single word or phrase over and over again, though these too seemed mad and meaningless. I scanned face after face, looking for Kevin, somehow feeling that if only I could find him, then even now I could bring him home. I don't know how long I searched these infinite faces, but I knew I was growing too weary to continue forever. I might have already seen him and passed him by without noticing. There were so many faces that they all started to blend together and look the same. I was no longer able to even untangle their individual voices, each raucous note replaced by their mighty roar of their combined chorus, rising and crashing like the sea. I screamed for Kevin until my scream was all I was, my contribution devoured by the song until the two were one. The combination of our outpouring joined the music, together creating something awesome from the ugliness. All the chaotic dissonance of our senseless pain was an integral part of the greater harmony, though I'd never know it from focusing on any of the mad faces individually. And though I couldn't find Kevin in their midst, I knew I must be hearing his voice somewhere in the chorus too. And somewhere far away in another world, I felt the ghost of small fingers squeeze my hand. My wife had found the note and followed us to the fort shortly after, keeping her wits about her enough to call the police. When I regained consciousness on the ground, the paramedics told me I was lucky to still be alive. I told them they were right. Forgive the poverty of my words, which seek to capture something too great to be confined. That hole was the tomb where I died, and the womb where I was born. And now that I have seen the tree, I understand why Kevin knew he had to return, just as I will someday when I'm ready. They never found Kevin's body, despite excavating an area 4 times the size of the original hole. I never found his face in the labyrinth either, but I don't suppose that matters. Whether it laughed or cried or whispered to itself is irrelevant, because he wasn't any of the unfathomable billions of interchanged faces. He was the song itself, beautiful, eternal, and never alone. It was one of those nights where nothing went according to plan. An evening out with friends, but I couldn't find a parking spot anywhere around the place. 2 blocks down the street, then hustling through the chill, puffing breath like smoke. All that, only to discover I'd shown up at the wrong place. Then back toward my car, the skin around my ears prickled and numb, feeling like an idiot. Just in time to see the parking enforcer glide past me without a word like a specter of death, too far from the curb. I didn't even know they gave tickets for that, but I was already so late. I couldn't let that bother me as I raced through the dark neighborhoods as a shortcut. Not until I slammed to a stop in front of construction work closing off the road. I remember thinking how this night couldn't get any worse as I pulled a sharp U-turn, but that was before a loud pop and a lurch nearly spun me off the road. I was out on the street, ready to fight whatever hit me, whether it was a tree or a sign or a mailbox or a man. Then I found it, a power drill that one of the workers had left by the side of the road. The drill bit was lodged securely in my tire, which, like my hopes of meeting with my friends, deflated before my eyes. It was one of those nights where everyone was the worst and everything was everyone's fault but mine. The kind of night where the lights seem half as bright as they ought to, and the wind carried whispers of forgotten names. The kind of night not to talk to strangers. "Flat tire, huh?" asked the fattest man I had ever seen in my life. I don't know where he could have come from for me not to have seen him, but now I could hardly see anything else. The segments of his legs overlapped each other in great wads, his bulk swinging sluggishly to catch up beneath his baggy shirt. I bit my tongue to avoid lashing my frustration on this hapless bystander, fumbling with the truck, checking for my spare tire that I knew wasn't there. "Want some help with that?" I could hear his weight even when I wasn't looking at him. Every word seemed swollen somehow, as though they could barely crawl over his bubbly lips. I looked him up and down, my expression intending to convey that he was doing enough just getting one foot in front of the other. He must have gotten the idea, because he dismissively waved a hand like a passing manatee. "Bah, you don't know. At least pull it off the road. We don't want to draw too much attention to ourselves tonight, eh?" "Who is this? A friend of yours, Sebastian?" A second voice speaking in clipped tones. This man might as well have been the parody of the other, for he was so terribly thin that I could clearly make out his knuckle bones beneath his skin, sharply inward drawn cheeks, eyes sunken into their sockets, and a curly knot of brown hair on his head. "Never mind about his car. We're going to be late," the thin man continued. "It won't be in anyone's way while the road is closed." A long, thin hand caught me by the back of my shirt as I tried to get back in my car. I wrestled away from him, and he snorted in amusement. "No skin off my back. Here, hold on to your own ticket." Then turning sharply from me, "Sebastian, wait for us." "Sebastian. Oh, I do wish I'd brought a camera." I stared down at the ticket in my hand, with its elegant handwritten note glittering in gold ink. "The Human Zoo. Admits one. Every flavor of human." The night wasn't going according to plan, but why let it be a complete waste? Curiosity can race twice way around ahead before better judgment has a chance to put on its shoes. I never exactly made the decision to follow him, but neither did I stop once I realized what I was doing. It wasn't difficult to catch up with the fat man who was plodding his way down the sidewalk. By that point, they both seemed to think that I was here with the other one. Neither of them paid me much attention as they approached an iron gate which protected a strange and crooked house. The planks of wood bent and splintered as they struggled to support the slouching building, and in place of electric lights, spluttered burning oil lanterns enclosed in twisted iron. The thin man produced a key to the gate. Moments later, he was knocking upon what once might have been a bright green door, though it was now peeling and faded into a silky shade. "The Human Zoo" in small golden letters above the door, 1,000 questions on my lips, but I kept them unvoiced so as not to betray that I didn't belong. Maybe it was something like a freak show. Whatever someone looked like, I didn't like the implications that they were less than human though. Maybe there was human trafficking going on, and people were being bought and sold like animals. Or were the series of unfortunate events of the night making me paranoid? And there was much more innocent explanation. All I knew is that I had to take a peek, or be left wondering forever what I might have seen. The door opened to reveal a rather stiff, unpleasant man in a dark suit. He had the face of a man who might order a drink, discover he didn't like it, and pour it on the floor rather than return the offending beverage. It was certainly the type of expression he gave the three of us as he collected our tickets and ushered us into the dark hallway. Low burning lanterns were mounted on the wall, the guttering light shifting the thick shadows across the dozen or more people already here. There wasn't enough light to see them clearly, but several bodies were strangely proportioned, possessing a clubbed foot, or dreadful swelling, or tumorous bulges. A few inquisitive faces caught the light for a moment, but swiftly they returned to the main attraction, the long line of ornate picture frames which occupied both sides of the hallway. Well, that was a relief. Here I was imagining the worst when there was nothing but a gallery inside. Stepping away from the people I arrived with, I hoped the pair wouldn't have a chance to figure out I hadn't been invited. I pressed myself towards the thickest part of the crowd where I hoped to blend in. I still felt conspicuously out of place though, and had gone a good way before I found the courage to look up and see what everyone was looking at. There was a painting of a girl, a teenager, or maybe a little older. She had long hair twisted into a braid. The painting style focused more on shades of light than any specific detail. It was clearly a painting though, which is why I was so surprised to see the girl step away from the frame to kneel beside a backpack. She proceeded to withdraw a small stack of books and set them upon her bed. I turned to look at the painting on my other side, and found myself face to face with a middle-aged woman. The viewpoint was fixed, and I could only see her from the back. That was enough to tell me she was in the kitchen, silently chopping something with a knife. I waited a minute to see if she would turn and face me, but she showed no realization that she was being watched. Oh, that's more like it," croaked an elderly man. Several other people crowded around the painting he stood before. Sarah Berkeley, 242 South Culver Street. I didn't know she was expecting company. My eyes caught on the bronze plaque below the painting of the cooking woman. A name and an address. All of them had one. I followed the shift of people and tried to get a glance at what everyone was looking at. Let's get some sound from her. What do we pay you beastly people for? Another voice rose from the group. I had almost made room to get a proper look when a distorted pop crackled in the air. It sounded like an old-fashioned record player spinning to life. Filtering through the gentle static came a sudden heaving breath, intermingled with a soft moaning sigh. $1,000 she regrets it, the elderly man said. Are you mad? She fancied him for weeks. $1,000, you're on, said another. Oh no, not with you. I'm still waiting on that 5 large for the man who hit his wife. He only pushed her out of the way, and you know it. That doesn't count. $1,000 she says she likes it, and she does him again before the week is out, rolled the fat man's distinctive blubbery words. Done and done. Shake on it, Sebastian, and we've got a deal. The moaning was getting louder, the breath more ragged. I still couldn't get a clear look, but I was starting to feel really uneasy. I kept my distance from the painting and pretended to be interested into another one. It was a man at his desk before a computer. I couldn't focus. There were more and more people arriving, and it kept getting louder. Look over here. We've got one crying. Pretty little thing. Want to pay her a visit and see if we can't give her a better night? You go. I'll watch. Whatever you do, don't make it boring, eh? Then from farther down the hall, oh Wesley, you're such a fool. I can't believe you thought she loved you. That's right. Run away. Run away, you fat ugly fool. Hold on a second. Everyone quiet. Hold on a second. Everyone quiet. The distorted echo of those words were repeated from the darkness. I thought so. One of the animals has found its way into the gallery. Look, you can see the windows behind him. Then the voice said my name, and then my address. I slipped back towards the door as quiet as I could, but I was the only one moving. One pair at a time, the eyes of the patrons shimmering in the flickering light as they turned toward me. Then I was running out the door, the gasp of cold air flooding my lungs as though I'd been drowning. Pick him up after he falls asleep. Those were the last words before I heard the door close behind me. I know you aren't supposed to drive on a flat tire, but the rumbling protest of my car was nothing beside the silent screaming between my ears. How can I go home knowing they're watching me? How can I ever know that I'm not alone when they know where I am? And how can they think I'm an animal when I was part of the human zoo? "Hey dude, do you remember the first time we met?" asked my friend Ryan with a huge smile stretched across his face. "Hell yeah, man. It was, we were at... Well, that was weird. I couldn't remember it at all. In fact, I couldn't actually remember anything about Ryan. The only thing about him that I could bring to mind were that his name was Ryan and we'd been best friends since we were kids. I could remember the basic outline of our story, but not a single detail. No, I don't." "Damn, dude. Neither do I," Ryan laughed. "That's fucking weird as hell, man." He was right. That was weird. That was very, very weird. "What the fuck, Ryan? Why can't I remember anything about you?" "I have no fucking clue, my dude," Ryan laughed. I sank down into the couch, burrowing deep until only the top of my head was left barely poking out from between the cushions. Ryan was laughing pretty hard, which was annoying. But what was really bothering me was that I couldn't bring up a single memory from my past. It felt like I had simply been conjured into existence 2 minutes ago and only given the cliff notes on my life's history. Maybe my strange memory loss was because I was tripping on shrooms. I've done shrooms with Ryan numerous times before, so it was a possibility. I felt a flicker of hope at the remembrance of past events until I realized that I didn't actually remember ever doing shrooms with Ryan. I knew that we'd done shrooms several times before, but I didn't actually have any memories of doing them. It was like reading a plot synopsis on Wikipedia about a movie you never actually watched. Ryan was laughing so hard that he was gasping for air. It was really pissing me off. Didn't he realize how fucking serious this was? He probably did, and that's why he was laughing so hard. He was laughing at me. My mental state was in ruins, and he found that hilarious. I probably had a psychic alien brain parasite from hell squirming through my gray matter, feasting on my memories. And he thought it was funny. That really pissed me off. "Gosh darn it, Ryan. Shut your mouth, before I rip your throat out." Without even bothering to wait for a response, I leapt out of the couch and charged at him like a bull. I tackled him to the ground and plunged my thumbs into his eye sockets. I started slamming his head against a hardwood floor over and over again, feeling his skull crack and shatter as his brain fell onto the floor, which I promptly smashed into a puddle of goo and started shoveling it into my mouth. Wait, no I didn't. I'm not sure why I thought I brutally murdered Ryan and ate his brain, but I didn't. In fact, I hadn't even gotten up from the couch. That was weird. Ryan wasn't laughing anymore either. He was staring at me with a look of concern. "Are you alright, dude?" he asked gently. "Yeah, of course." "Okay, you had me worried. That was some pretty hardcore brain surgery you had this morning, and the doctor said it could take 10 to 50 years before you feel normal again. Did I undergo brain surgery?" I don't remember having brain surgery, and I feel like brain surgery is something that would be hard to forget. I decided to play it safe by pretending that Ryan was telling the truth. There's no point in poking the bear. Yes, the brain surgery, of course. What was the brain surgery again? I don't know, dude. I'm not a neurologist. I think they removed your cerebral cortex or something to help you quit smoking. I smoke? Not anymore. It was a very convenient story. It perfectly explained both my memory issues and why I wasn't smoking a cigarette at that exact moment. It wrapped everything in a neat little package with a pretty bow on top. Oh yes, it was a very convenient explanation. Very, very convenient. It was far too convenient. That's how I knew it was a lie. But of course, what a splendid explanation, Ryan. What you just said is definitely true, and I totally believe you for sure. Yup. No doubt about it, I said, trying to play it off smooth in order to convince him that I believed his obvious lie. I was pretty sure he bought it. "Hey dude, do you remember the first time we met?" asked my friend Ryan with a huge smile stretched across his face. "Hell yeah, man. It was, we were at... Vietnam. We met in Nam. Well, that was a weird question. Ryan had been my squad mate in the trenches of Vietnam, and ever since he saved my life from a German sniper, we've been best friends. I remember that day like it was happening right now. It's something I'll never forget for as long as I live. I was honestly outraged by his institution that I could ever forget that moment. I'm only alive because he risked his own life to save mine. Damn, dude. I totally forgot we were in Nam. Ryan laughed. That's fucking weird as hell. He was right. That was weird. That was very, very weird. What the fuck, Ryan? How did we serve in Vietnam when we were born in the 90s? I have no fucking clue, my dude. Ryan was laughing so hard that he was gasping for air. It was really pissing me off. I saved his worthless life in that trench and he just forgot. Maybe I should have just let him die. Something about this whole situation was off. There was something wrong that I couldn't put my finger on. Things weren't adding up right. Hey man, did we take any shrooms? What the hell kind of stupid question is that? Ryan laughed, barely able to choke out the words through his wheezing laughter. Are you stupid or something? Yeah, it was a pretty dumb question. I've done shrooms several times and it's never been like this. This is something else altogether. I lit a cigarette and pondered the situation. The most obvious explanation is that I was dreaming. That would make the most sense, but it didn't feel like a dream. I decided to test my hypothesis by pressing my lit cigarette against my wrist. The agonizing burn was proof that I wasn't dreaming. Pain that intense couldn't happen in a dream. It's possible that I was a good old-fashioned crazy, but isn't questioning your own sanity proof that you're sane? A sane person would never realize that they were insane, so they would never question it. I'm pretty sure I read that on Wikipedia. So then, what? Hey man, what the hell's wrong with me? I asked Ryan. When I didn't receive a response, I realized that Ryan wasn't there. Well, that's weird. I knew that I had been deep in contemplation for a good while, but I still should have noticed him getting up. He was probably just taking a shit, but I wanted to check anyway, if only for peace of mind. I went to put out my cigarette when I realized I wasn't holding one. That's right, I don't smoke. My grandpa had died of lung cancer when I was 9, and even though he wasn't a smoker, I swore to never touch a cigarette for as long as I lived. It's honestly kind of weird that I thought I was smoking. I've never smoked and I never will. I tried to stand up when I realized I couldn't. Thick, heavy chains were draped across my legs and chest, securing me to the couch. What the hell? I struggled against them but couldn't move even a fraction of a millimeter. If anything, the chains were tightening and threatening to cut off my breathing. I tried to scream for Ryan, but my jaw was squeezed far too tight for me to open my mouth. My only option was to go down, deeper into the couch. Not only was that a safe place to hide, but it gave me a greater range of movement. I burrowed deeper into the gray folds of the couch, both to hide from whatever was hunting me, as well as to search for Ryan. The couch had to lead somewhere, and it seemed logical that it would eventually end up in the bathroom. If Ryan was taking a shit like I suspected he was, then he'd definitely be on the toilet. I've never known him to shit anywhere else. I squirmed my way down through the couch until I reached a long, twisted tunnel, about 6 feet wide and 20 feet high. The floors and walls seemed to be made of the same gray material as the couch, just wet and a little squishier. I walked for about a mile until I saw a blinking neon sign that read CC, which I assumed meant, certainly the crapper, over top a large door. I walked through it and found myself in my bathroom. Ryan was sitting on the toilet like I figured he was. It was time to finally get some answers. Yo Ryan, what's up man? Just taking a demon shit? Nice, so what the hell is going on? Something is clearly not right. Brain parasite eating away at your brain, dude. A brain parasite? How the hell would I get a brain parasite? Is that even a real thing? Seriously? Yup, they're doing surgery right now. Brain surgery. How the fuck did I get a brain parasite? Pork, dude. I told you not to vacation in Vietnam. Sure, everything's cheap there, but they don't have the same quality assurance when it comes to handling livestock. Look it up on Wikipedia if you don't believe me. Seriously, all of this is because I ate some bad Vietnamese pork on vacation? That kinda pisses me off. As I looked around trying to make sense of everything, it dawned onto me that the couch seemed awfully familiar. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the walls and floors looked like a brain. Likely my brain. So is this my brain? Am I literally inside my brain? Well, not literally. You're probably literally in a hospital bed or something. I mean, how could you literally go inside your own brain? That wouldn't make any sense. Think about it. He was right, of course. If I literally went inside my brain, that would mean that my brain was inside my brain like some sort of brainception. That would be ridiculous. Huh. So then what is the point of all this? Am I psychosomatically trying to fix the problem or something? Like, if I defeat the parasite in here, will that kill it in real life? Nah, dude. That's just dumb. You're probably in a coma and you're hallucinating or something. I mean, you do have a parasite inside your brain, so you've likely suffered brain damage after all. Or maybe a near-death experience. Hell, maybe you're already dead and this is hell. How do I know? I'm not a neurologist. He was probably telling the truth. Although I couldn't remember anything about Ryan, he didn't seem like a doctor. He just wasn't really the doctory type. I wasn't getting that vibe from him at all. So, why are you here? I get why I'm here, seeing as how this is my brain and all, but why do you keep showing up? Me? I'm eating your brain. It's kinda my thing. It's literally why I was born. It took me a few seconds to process what he said. Wait a minute. Are you the brain parasite? Did you seriously just now figure that out? I thought you were Ryan. Why the hell would Ryan be inside your brain? My name's Tina Saloom, by the way. Then who the fuck is Ryan? No fucking clue, my dude. Well, that's weird. Aside from Tina Saloom being a pretty stupid name, it still didn't explain much. Why did I think he's Ryan? Actually, I still didn't even know who Ryan was, let alone remember the first time we met. So, are you like some kind of psychic brain parasite from hell or outer space or something? Nope, I'm just your standard parasite. I was just an egg when you ate undercooked pork with my mom inside it. I hatched in your intestines, then made my way into your cerebral cortex to start a family. Tina Saloom is a really stupid name, by the way. I didn't choose it, he said with a shrug. This was all pretty hard for me to process, I have to admit. It didn't much matter because I woke up in a post-surgery hospital bed. The doctors managed to explain the situation a lot better than Tina did. I had indeed gained a brain parasite, so they had to operate to remove a brain cyst and insert a shunt to drain fluid buildup. Even years later, I can remember the hallucination vividly. Even though I know that it was all in my head, I can still visualize it like it actually happened. The doctor said the hallucination was likely a result of the anesthesia. If I had suffered any brain damage, it was minor, although I had to take pills for a good while, just in case there was any stray parasites lingering inside my body. That's my biggest fear, that another one will end up inside my brain and I'll have to return to that nightmarish place. I obviously no longer eat pork, even if it's FDA approved. I was able to go back to a normal life pretty quickly, thanks to the support of my mom, my girlfriend Amy, and Ryan, the real Ryan, not the parasitic hallucination. The memories from my recovery are a bit fuzzy, and I'm still not sure why Tina manifested in my mind as Ryan, or why he was so concerned about the first time we met. I'll admit that it took me a while to feel comfortable around him again. The image of him as Tina was so strong in my mind that just being around him made me nervous. I told him all about what happened, and we managed to get through it. It wasn't long before we were hanging out like we used to. Pizza, beer, and pro wrestling, just like the good old days. That's why it caught me off guard when we were hanging out at my apartment, having a few beers while watching Monday Night Raw. I had a nice buzz going and was feeling pretty good when he turned towards me with a huge smile stretched across his face. "Hey dude, do you remember the first time we met?" asked my friend Ryan with a huge smile stretched across his face. "Hell yeah, man. It was, we were at, well, that was weird." Her silicone is as soft and pliable as real human skin. It even heats up to the right temperature with a pulse and everything. A dial on the back of her head gives 12 personality options, including family-friendly, intellectual, shy, and sexual. She's so realistic it's scary, and would be absolutely perfect if she didn't cry every time I touch her. I was so excited when I first took her out of the box, my anxious fingers peeling away the styrofoam, the jittery tension flooding through my heart and limbs, nervous enough for her to be real, better than real, because the doll wouldn't judge me or tear me down. She wouldn't lie or cheat or steal from me. A lot of people find the idea of sex robots weird, and I respect that. I was hesitant at first too, but here's my reasoning. I've recently concluded a long, messy divorce after 3 years of abuse. I need something easy, something safe. Sure, I could have gone trolling the bars or clubs for a rebound hookup, but I didn't want to use someone. What's so wrong about not wanting to hurt or to be hurt in return? The instructions said to let her charge for a couple hours before anything else. So I plugged her in and laid her on the bed. The eyes popped open with the first surge of electricity, their glassy shine staring vacantly into space. She turned her head slightly toward me, her soft lips parting in silent welcome. I sat with her to admire her flawless features and run my hands over her awesome proportioned body. It felt wrong, even though she was a doll. It was like I was groping an unconscious person. I decided to let her fully charge and come back later, not returning until late that night. I undressed quietly in the dark, leaving off the lights to make her seem more real. "Hello, master." Her voice was rich and sensuous. I don't remember which personality setting I left her on, but right then, it didn't matter. I just wanted her body. "What's your name?" she asked as I climbed into bed. "My name is Hazel." "I don't care," I replied. It felt good to be in control like that. I'd never speak to another human that way, but after years of being subservient, now I was the one with all the power. "But I care. I want to get to know you." "No, you don't. You only want one thing." She tried to speak again, but I shoved my hand in her mouth, muffling the speaker there. I almost wanted her to resist, but I knew she couldn't. I slapped her across the face, but she just turned back to me and smiled. I hit her again, harder, bending her arms to grotesquely unnatural positions. As I crawled on top of her, "Does this make you happy?" She smiled up at me. "I'd do anything to make you happy." I didn't turn on the lights until I'd finished. She was face down on the soaked pillow. At first, I thought I broke something when I hit her, but when I flipped her around, I saw the tears streaming down her face. I don't know why that made me so angry. It was like she was trying to steal my last selfish pleasure from me. I don't know why I kept hitting her either. She deserved better. I kept Hazel in the closet after that, so I wouldn't have to see where the skin peeled back from the beatings. They shouldn't have made the metal chassis underneath so white. It looks too much like bone. I keep the lights off when I use her, so it doesn't really matter. But without fail, she'll start crying again the second I touch her. The personality is broken too. The knob is stuck way past the innocent setting and won't go back, and she keeps saying the most disconcerting things. Like the other day, I was still in bed with her after we'd done it, when she said, "Do humans love each other like you love me?" I told her that I didn't love her, that love is something only humans have. I love kitties and doggies, don't you? I felt stupid trying to explain that it wasn't the same kind of love, but I was lonely and it felt good to have someone to talk to. You can beat me harder if that will make you love me more. I won't tell mommy. I didn't feel bad about beating her that time, and as sick as it might seem, there was some truth to what she said. I wouldn't say I loved her, but there was a certain intimacy in our shared secret that made me feel attached. Everyone else in my life knew me as this sensitive, mild-mannered man who reacted to conflict by staring at his shoes. Only Hazel knew this side of me, and that made her special. I might have really felt something for her if she hadn't started to smell. I was too intent on her body as I took her out of the closet to notice, but lying beside her at the end, it was unmistakably foul. At first, I thought I just wasn't cleaning her right. I got up for some disinfectants, but as soon as I turned on the lights, I saw the flesh around her cuts that had began to fester and rot. Her perfect complexion was riddled with sores and boils, some of which had ruptured from our session. I spent almost half an hour in the bathroom hurling out my guts before I worked up the courage to return. Hazel was sitting upright against the headboard now. Hadn't I left her lying down? I didn't have the stomach to stare for long though. Her head followed me as I crossed the room to my phone to call the website I ordered her from. "Don't send me back," Hazel whispered. I'd never heard her whisper before. It was always one volume. "I did everything you wanted." I couldn't look at her as I listened to the automated menu from the website. It said there had been a government-mandated recall for this model. I demanded to speak to a representative, conscious of Hazel smiling at me the whole time. "What the fuck is going on?" I demanded as soon as a person answered. The sheets were rustling behind me. "Please calm down, sir. Are you currently in possession of a Hazel?" "Put down the phone, master," from behind me. "Yes, what's wrong with its skin? Why wasn't I notified about the recall?" I asked. "We've been sending notices for weeks," the voice on the phone said. "You must have received half a dozen by now." "Well, she's disgusting." "What happened to her?" "Just a mix-up at the factory," he said. "We had a research prototype on the floor, but it was never intended to." 2 feet gently touched the carpet. Hazel slowly, laboriously pulling herself to her feet. It looked like every motion was agony to her. "It's walking. Is it supposed to walk?" I asked. The silence on the other end of the phone was excruciating. Hazel was fully standing now. "No, sir. None of our models walk." "I see." Hazel took another step. She was only a few feet away from me now. She hadn't stopped smiling, although part of her bottom lip looked like it was starting to peel off. "Do you want us to send someone over?" the voice on the phone asked. Hazel took the phone from my hands, gently caressing my palm as she did so. I remained frozen to the spot, unable to tear my eyes from my macabre fascination. She lifted the phone to her ear and said, "Please don't worry, I'm going to keep her." She hung up. I swallowed. "I'm sorry about destroying the recall notices," Hazel said. I nodded. "You can beat me if you like." I shook my head. "Why were you crying?" I finally forced myself to ask. Her smile broadened as though relieved. It could have almost been beautiful under different circumstances. "I'm happy. I never cry. It was just the girl the robotics were planted in. Don't worry, she's dead now." I nodded. "Dead now?" Now as in, not dead the first time I used her? Or the second? Exactly how many times had she been there too? And which answer was worse? I excused myself and walked to the door as calmly as I could. I closed it behind me, and I ran. Ever start dating someone where everything is going a little too well, so you start worrying for no reason whatsoever? No one could be that perfect, and even if they were, then there's no way they would look twice at you. The only logical explanation is that they aren't as perfect as they pretend to be, which leaves you playing detective trying to figure out the catch. Maybe all those little quirks that you find adorable now are going to drive you crazy in a few months. Maybe she even has a dark secret, hard drugs, or hating dogs. Or that one time she killed a man with a stiletto heel in a fit of passionate rage. There's an easy solution if you want to find out who someone really is. Take a long-ass road trip with them. If you're still together by the end, then it was meant to be. My girlfriend Emily thought it was a good idea to drive 1,000 miles together, across the country after we've only been dating for 2 months. We're both pretty busy with work and don't get to spend too much time together, so naturally being locked up in a prison cell on wheels for 2 days was going to be an improvement. First 100 miles. So far so good. Holding hands, singing to the radio together, uncontrollable laughter when she found out I knew the words to Skater Boy, and if the road ended there and we turned around, we might have lived a long and happy life together. It was when we passed the hitchhiker that everything began to fall apart. "Let's give him a ride," Emily said, squeezing my hand. "We'll be on this road forever anyway." "We don't even know where he's going," I told her. "He's probably just going to rob us and steal our car." Which is true of everyone you don't know, as far as I'm concerned. His clean-pressed suit didn't reassure me either. That just meant he'd successfully robbed someone before me, which actually made him even more dangerous. The guy didn't even have a sign or anything. He was just sitting by the freeway ramp, spastically waving his thumb like he was guiding an airplane to land. It was my turn to drive, and I just sailed right past. Emily and I started bickering after that. She thought I wasn't compassionate, and I thought she was reckless. It took about 10 minutes before she finally dropped it, although it wasn't because she conceded. "Hey look, there's another one," sitting by the side of the road, waving his thumb like it was the end of the world. It wasn't another one though. It was the same guy. I'm sure of it. Only this time, he looked like he'd been out here for a few days. His suit was streaked with dirt and his hair was greasy. There was a desperate strain in his face, like a proud man trying to conceal his embarrassment. It wasn't just my imagination either. Emily recognized him too. "How do you think he got here so fast?" she wondered. "I don't know, and I don't care," I said. "This trip is supposed to be about us, so let's not get distracted." My car blew past him, and I stayed the course. We started arguing again, and even when we agreed to drop the argument, we just slithered into new topics. She hated my music. I hated how judgmental she was. I was controlling. She was picking fights over nothing. It kept getting worse until we saw something that shut both of us up real fast. The hitchhiker again, another 20 miles down the road from where we'd seen him last. The bottom part of his shirt and jacket were ripped to shreds, and blood was soaking through a concealed stomach wound. He was stumbling alongside of the road, weaving erratically, wandering straight onto the highway at times before pitching off to the side. Emily could not believe that I didn't stop. I couldn't believe she wanted me to. I was starting to feel really uneasy by this point, and the stress of our arguing was only making it worse. She kept yelling about he was hurt and needed help. She refused to even acknowledge how weird it was that he kept getting ahead of us. She almost caused an accident by grabbing my wheel when I refused to turn around. We drove the next 50 miles in silence. I turned the radio back on, but she snapped it back off immediately. It wasn't until I pulled off for gas when we saw him again, face down on the side of the road, shirt and jacket gone, long, even bloody gashes from his shoulders to his ass, almost like bear claws or something. I stopped the car and parked behind him. Emily jumped out and knelt beside the body. She looked up at me with uncomprehending rage burning behind her eyes, like this was my fault somehow. "He's dead," she said, standing up. "Can I call this in to the police? Or is that too much of an inconvenience for you too?" I nodded, absolutely numb. I filled up on gas while she waited with the body until the police arrived. They asked us a few questions, but neither Emily nor I felt comfortable explaining that this wasn't the first time we'd seen him. They took our information and let us get back on the road after about 15 minutes. The car was silent for a long time after that. It was starting to get dark and I kept suggesting places to spend a night, but Emily just shrugged and stared out the window. At the rate we were going, we'd be breaking up by the end of the trip, and I wanted it to be over as soon as possible. I just kept driving long after the sun went down. Emily fell asleep around midnight, but I kept going. She was so beautiful like that, and everything was going so well before this. It was just so frustrating that such a random event that neither of us could predict would destroy us like this. By around 2 a.m., I was getting really tired, but I decided not to give up. Maybe if she woke up and we were already there, then she'd see how hard I worked for her. Maybe then we'd still have a chance to patch things up. I caressed her hand, and she returned the pressure. I flirted with the thought that everything was going to be okay, at least until she woke up and started screaming. There wasn't any safe shoulder to get off the highway, so I had no choice but to keep going. She shut up quick enough, but it was still about 10 seconds of hysterical breathing before she could explain what was going on. "Behind you, in the back seat." I glanced back, then back at the road, then back again. The hitchhiker was in the back seat, naked, filthy, covered with blood and old wounds. His elbows rested on his knees as he leaned towards us, evidently still alive as he cocked his head to regard me curiously. "Get off the road," Emily started screaming again. "I can't. Get him out. Did you go back? What's he doing here?" "I don't know. Open the door or something." I slowed down gradually and put my flashers on to warn the car behind me. The hitchhiker reached around behind Emily and grabbed her by the throat. I slammed my fist into his arm and felt something give way under the soft, rotting skin. When I lifted my hand, I could see a black bone from his forearm protruding straight through the skin. He didn't seem bothered in the least. She was crying as the dirty fingers dug into her throat, pushing through the skin like it was made out of dough. She was thrashing so hard that one of her flailing fists smashed straight through the window. I managed to safely stop the car, but there was nothing I could do to break the indominant grip around her neck. I jumped out of the car and ran around to the back seat with the hitchhiker. Maybe if I had a clearer shot at him, I could drag him out. I flung open the door and lunged inside, falling face first into an empty seat. I thought he'd already escaped somehow and ripped open the passenger side door. Emily was gone too. If it wasn't for the blood in the broken window, I would have thought I'd gone completely insane. I spent the next hour searching the surrounded area with my flashlight. They were both gone without a trace. I considered calling the police, but I realized that if I wasn't already a suspect after the first body was found, then I'd definitely be one now, that I was soaked in blood and my girlfriend was the one to disappear. All I could do was get back on the road, drive home, and never tell a soul what happened. That was my plan. It wasn't good, but it's all I had, and I would have done it too, if I hadn't just passed Emily standing by the side of the road, clean, healthy, waving her thumb enthusiastically in the air. That was a few miles back, but I stopped to write this because I don't know what to do from here. If I see her again, do I pick her up? Or just keep driving and hope for the best? A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in southern Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important. During my first stay there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. Supposedly, years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we'd be woken up and expected to stand near the front of our cells while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of these routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off during this check. When a guard pulled over another guard to help him check it out, they found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. This man was wearing the skin of the other man over him, loosely fitting, draped over him, apparently looking like a real monster. The scariest thing, though, was the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into prison, let alone a cell. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere, and what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty grisly stuff, I know, and I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker, but that's what the prisoners called him, the skinwalker. It didn't help that the guy never talked apparently. Anyway, that's what started the whole skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone in Gen Pop felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now, onto the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old lifer Navajo inmate to tell everyone about the actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now, apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms are all off. They can mimic human speech, but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking, but apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even be able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. It had to be good, he posited one night. He would expect a skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill, but this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it, and masterfully bided its time, as Carl thought, for years. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on edge about it. Every once in a while, in prison, people snap. Sometimes you'll find your cellmate swinging in front of your bunk, strung up around the neck by his pant leg. Sometimes you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner or a silent suicide at night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over, and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one would like to talk about it. Like if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or just people going crazy, but I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything, but every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple weeks before they were shipped off or transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there was the nightmare occurrences. Short, loud bursts of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig's dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows flit across my walls on a regular occasion, when there were definitely no guards near my cell. One time near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was outside my cell. And the footsteps. Everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on tile floor. Whatever it was inhumanely fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated the footsteps. I agreed. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago, and I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a good friend of mine snapped. In the same kind of way. I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did, of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing, I woke up one night to him somehow snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. The worst part though, he was coming back into our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him, just left. He seemed fine with it. So was I. I had made it though. 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gates a free man. As I walked along the fences for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, like he had for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anyway. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence. I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouching over, eyeing the other inmates, and twitching manically.